Good afternoon. We're going to cover some very touchy questions early on. So if you're disgusted, you can leave early on. I guess all of you know that we are a government of laws, not of men. I tell you, one group doesn't seem to understand that. The Roman Catholic hierarchy of this country, which has decided that they should license a condemnation of the President of the United States, whose name is Biden, because there are abortions held in this country. Abortions are the rule and the law of the land. It's called Roe versus Wade. And Mr. Biden has nothing to do with that. And he himself doesn't want an abortion. His wife doesn't want an abortion. But he is president of a country that has a law that allows legal abortion. So apparently, the Catholics of this state, at least, are out of step with reality. And they would be much better off. Here comes my close friend. Come right in. I knew you'd be. Oh, okay. And my other close friend, Flossie. So we're talking about the failure of a certain group of leaders in this country who think that they should make it official that they condemn the President of the United States because he allows abortions. It's not he who allows abortions. It's never been a he or a she. It's allowed by the law. And we are a nation of laws, not of men. It's very important to remember that for the rest of this conversation today. And somebody please turn off their cell phone. So we're going to talk about a friend of mine who is involved in a scandalous affair, which is being celebrated this month because it's an anniversary. It's the anniversary of the Pentagon Papers. Now, many of you are too young to remember, but there was somebody named Nixon in the White House. There was a dreadful attorney general who went to jail. Mitchell. There was his wife who was even more dreadful, Martha Mitchell. And there were two editors who were threatened with jail. The editor of the New York Times and the editor of the Washington Post. There's a town in Southern California called Santa Monica. Some of you have heard of it. There's a very famous research center there, the Rand Corporation. One bright and sunny day, a man walked out of the Rand Corporation carrying a lot of documents. His name is Daniel Ellsberg. The documents he carried with him were the Pentagon Papers. It pointed out to this country, which is always asleep, that during the long period of the Eisenhower years, the planning for Vietnam went on, step by tiny step, that led us to the quagmire that was the first war we ever lost. And we did lose the Vietnam War. It's a very long story, and I don't want to bore you to death. How to start? The Vietnamese people were actually invaders. Vietnamese people, as a tribe, lived in southern China. They were driven out of southern China by the Chinese. And so they moved into the Red River Delta. which is Vietnam. And then, since they were beaten up by everybody, they decided to beat up everybody else. So they drove the native people out of the area of what is now North Vietnam, and then invaded central Vietnam, and then invaded southern Vietnam, driving all the locals out. Many of the locals were Khmer people. Khmer is a code word for Cambodians. And so it was that one group beat up another group, beat up another group. The Catholics hadn't arrived yet to beat up anybody, but they're going to come. So the Vietnamese are now out of Han China. Han is a word to describe ethnic Chinese, Han Chinese. They've moved south to get away from the Han Chinese, and they're now in the south, and they're beating their way down into two big rivers, the Red River Delta in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south. And they're going to make a country out of that called Vietnam. The French are going to come, always looking for trouble. The French have lost a great empire. It's the empire of Napoleon Bonaparte. And after Napoleon goes off to Elba, we have the Second Empire. French take over Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, North Africa, and then they go to Asia. They see a chance by happenstance. French colonials had arrived. First it was French missionaries, those Catholics again, French missionaries. Then it was French merchants, people willing to sell goods. And when they got in trouble, it was the French military. Got it? Missionaries, merchants, military. They took over the south of Vietnam first. We call that part Cochin China. They liked what they saw. They moved up. They took over Annam, and then they took over the Red River Delta. 3 parts to French Indochina, half India, half Chinese civilizations. They borrowed from both India and China to build this Indochina. And the French were still anxious for more, so they took over Laos and they took over Cambodia. So now they own the headwaters of the greatest river in Southeast Asia, the Mekong. They make of that a brilliant agricultural land. They grew more rice than anybody. It was the rice bowl of Asia. They sent rice to China and to Japan. And when Japan took over Vietnam in World War II, they wanted the rice more than anything, although there was another great factor. Rubber came to South Asia from Brazil. The rubber trees are plentiful in Brazil. The French brought them in and grew them and then tapped the rubber. All you have to do is have a rubber tree that's around 20 years old, and you go around and cut the circumference, and rubber drips out into pails, and then you take the pails. And the French were so good at this that they cornered the market. Certainly you must have noticed that if you really had a good car, you wanted to put good tires on a good car. And the greatest tire you could buy for your good car was a Michelin. And Michelin is the name of a big rubber company and it is outside of Paris, and it has the largest rubber plantation in the world, Plantation du Terre Rouge and Plantation du Michelin, and these are in Vietnam. So the French brought the rubber from Asia, and it's another walking zombie, and brought the rubber to manufacture for the world. It's one of the largest companies that you can buy either the rubber itself or the tires. So you have two things. In the south, in the Mekong Delta, the French are excellent engineers, and they drained the river and then put these islands together in such a way that you could grow rice, unbelievable amounts of rice, which you could export. You can only eat so much rice. And they had the rubber. They also had tin and other items that they could export. So Vietnam became a very rich French colony when you combine it with Cambodia and with Laos. And in that area is one of the greatest marvels of the world. Did everybody bring their cell phone with them? And the marvel of the world, you can go see it even today, is the temple complex at Angkor Wat. A huge, huge complex that is there for tourists to see, sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. All right, you've got the French arriving, you have them settling. Again, it was missionaries, merchants, military, taking over three parts, making all of Vietnam, and then adding Laos and Cambodia. So that you have this gigantic colony. What about the Americans? Well, as usual, we are late, and we do a very bad job. When the missionaries came, they were very successful, and they converted a lot of Vietnamese to Catholicism. And so it was, and then came war, a war with the French and the Vietnamese. French versus Vietnamese, Vietnamese versus French. In that process, France lost. She lost her jewel of her empire in Asia. She tried to make the best she could of it. She signed an agreement finally to leave at Geneva. We had a very haughty Secretary of State at the time, Foster Dulles, and he refused to speak to anybody. But the French signed anyway, whether Dulles liked it or not. And it was only a half sign. They granted independence to Vietnam, but the North would be under a Northern leadership, Ho Chi Minh, you've heard the name, and the one in the South would be under Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a Catholic, a convert to Catholicism, and a very strong believer. During the early Eisenhower years, Ngo Dinh Diem left Vietnam and moved to New Jersey. And in New Jersey, he joined a Maryknoll group and lived with them in their monastery. He was a very, very devout Roman Catholic. He then came back to Vietnam with his awful relatives. I mean, if you think you have bad relatives, you haven't met anybody till you met his relatives. His brother was the head of the secret police. Ngo Dinh knew, but it was his sister-in-law. There's never been a worse sister-in-law in all the history of sister-in-laws like this sister-in-law, Madame New. All this is going on. Slowly but surely, the Americans are being dragged in. What do they do first? Well, they give assistance, that is, military aid. Then that isn't enough. Then they give military advisors. That's military people, alive people. And soon they're going to give a military army, and that's where the war gets bad. That's sister. Well, she came to California. She liked California. Why? Well, we had the most regressive state in the Union. I know that you all think it's a wonderful paradise, but back in the 60s, Senator Knight and Senator Nolan were hard-knocked Republicans, and they were for the China lobby. And the China lobby meant we hate all who are not nationalist Chinese on the island of Taiwan. We will do nothing with Red China, which is evil, and we will avoid everything else. Nevertheless, she came. She was very attractive. She gave a news conference. Now, what was happening that would make this very Madam Dragon Lady give us a news conference here? Well, something had gone wrong back in Vietnam. The largest number of people in Vietnam are not Catholics, thank God. They're Buddhist. And they felt they were mistreated and didn't have their rights. Unfortunately, radical Buddhists among the group convinced a number of bonzes, that's Buddhist leaders, to go into the middle of the square of a street of a town, wherever they were, to sit down on the street, pour gasoline over their head, and to burn themselves alive in public for all to see. And Buddhist bonzes were doing that everywhere. Da Nang, Hue, Saigon, Mito, Kanto. So this is very talky because you silly Americans had elected a Roman Catholic to be president. His name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So here were people like David Halberstam and others, famous people in the press, reporting on these people who were burning themselves to death in demonstrations that they were treated badly by their government because of their religion. So here's Madame New. She arrives in San Francisco with her daughter. She gives a news conference. And she has the cojones to say every country needs another Buddhist barbecue. So she refuses to recognize the rights of the Buddhists to have their own religion recognized as well as Catholicism. Now, there had already been a divide in Vietnam where the North had been given over to Ho Chi Minh and the South had been taken over by Ngo Dinh Diem. And in the North, over 1 million Catholics lived. So the first 100 days of the separation, there was this division. You could cross the border, and over 1 million Catholics from the North came south. So this was a powerful force against any communist state. And many communists went north. These are the people that formed the famous Viet Cong that we fight later. So we're stuck in this. Kennedy's stuck. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know which side to fall on. He calls on his rather famous Berkeley graduate, who also went to Harvard, the Berkeley of the East. He was a Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, McNamara. And McNamara decides on a policy. We will support Ngo Dinh Diem, We will do whatever we have to do. We haven't sent enough troops, then we'll send more troops. We ended up sending 1 million Americans, most of them dying in the rice paddies or in the high river or in the triple canopy jungle of Vietnam, and also when we incurred and brought the war to Cambodia and to Laos. Some of you might know that film about Air America, and also the film about Good Morning Vietnam. The greatest film about this period is actually a French film, won an Academy Award. It's called Indochina, and it stars the very beautiful Catherine Deneuve. But films didn't help. Nothing did. No one seemed to understand. So guess what? They sent me. I went to Vietnam as a soldier. I served with the 1st Infantry Division in Nam. We were stationed north of Saigon. There were 18,000 of us, divided into 3 locations. One south, very close to Saigon itself, one halfway up in Phu Long province, and one all the way up near the border. I lived with the division troops because I was a division intelligence officer. And there were 18,000 of us scattered under 3 large base camps. Base camps never moved. Smaller things moved. And our base camp was on Plantation du Terre Rouge. And this base camp was expected to kill the enemy. The enemy wouldn't fight like John Wayne fights, out in the open, in the daytime, where they can be seen. They fought at night. They owned the night. We never left our base camp at night. It was too dangerous. We have many books about this period. I forgot to bring my own. But Bernard Fall, a great Frenchman, was there when I was there. And he wrote several books, but the one that's best known is Hell is a Very Small Place. Hell for him was a valley in the north where the forces of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army gathered to trap a French unit in Dien Bien Phu, and they destroyed it. In the process, a great military leader, but it was Viet Cong leader, set up a certain way of doing battle. They were not going to come out and let you see them in the daytime, because we had all the tanks, we had all the heavy weapons. They didn't have anything. Ngo Dinh Diem had already suffered greatly as the leader of his family. He had to watch his brother, his senior brother, be buried alive. The NVA, the communists, are very serious. We used to sleep at night with one eye open. I remember telling my group, we had Vietnamese women come in to clean the area around we all lived in tents. GP mediums sleep around 8 guys. And unfortunately, some of them were controlled by the VC. So they'd spend all day long with a grenade in their hand, and they pull the pin, which should blow off their head. So they held it very carefully, and held the pin down with this one, and caked the grenade in mud, clay, laterite clay, until it dried. And then they opened it up, and it didn't go off. And then they packed rice, cooked rice, around the hand grenade. And then they brought it with them onto our base. And then when we weren't looking, I tell you, it's hard to explain to Americans. We lived in these tents, in these rubber plantations, and we went out to one of the rubber trees, where we hung up a 10-gallon can. And then we took off all our clothes and we pulled the string and we got a shower. And since the rubber trees grew in an area of laterite, which is hard red clay, the water ran down this pipe we put on at the face of where we were showering. Well, when no one was looking, the woman snuck over and put the rice ball down the pipe. And then hour by hour, shower by shower, day by day, the rice peeled off and the mud peeled off. And guess what? It blew off the feet of a lot of young GIs. You're standing there taking a shower, there's an explosion, and your feet are gone. Not a very nice way to die. So when it was discovered, I made a rule. Nobody will come onto our compound where I sleep. Nobody. You have to understand these Vietnamese civilians, they were all going to school. Maybe you don't know the way that the British and the French used to rule, but they would try and get around 10% of the top people in the country to go to their schools. You'd go to school in Vietnam until you could speak perfect French, and then you'd go back to Paris and study at a Grande École. So they had captured the elite by educating them, and they spoke beautiful French and took all the right subjects and got free scholarships to go to Paris to study. And even to this very day, if you go with me on an Air France flight to Paris, there's a very large part of Paris that is controlled by the Vietnamese. They live there. They never left home. The words of Thomas Wolfe, "You can't go home again," they believed it. So they made a life for themselves, and today they're part of the French population, just like the Algerians, just like the Tunisians, just like the Moroccans. But we were still there, trying to figure out how to get out. So there's McNamara again, stupid McNamara. He decides, how many people are living now in Vietnam, in North? Okay, let's say 20,000, 20 million. What we will do is we'll run a body count so that every day, every unit will report the number of dead enemy they have killed. Now, do you know how hard? Let me tell you, unbelievable. We used to have these airstrikes. They weren't just an airplane and a bomber. They were arc strikes. They were B-52 bombers, 4, 8, 10 of them together. And they would fly to targets from Okinawa, the Japanese island, down to Vietnam and bomb a location we had selected. You know how much? These were over $1 million bombing raids. And when this bomb went off, one time I remember briefing General Abrams. The bomb went off in an area called the Pineapple Plantation. There were lots of pineapples grown in Vietnam. And after the raid the next morning, we flew out a group of ordinary GIs, ARPs they're called, aerial rifle platoon, to count the number of dead. Do you have any idea what a bomb does to a human body? You find 5 arms here and 3 legs there and 2 heads here. And you're 18 years old and you're supposed to use your imagination and say, well, 2 arms and 1 head counts as 1 person, and another 1 head and 2 arms count. And that's how they did their BDA, bomb damage assessment. And McNamara literally thought that if we killed enough of those people, there would be nobody in the North to send down to fight us anymore, and they'd surrender. Well, it didn't work out. Another losing opportunity for us to show how stupid we were. But we still fought on. All this is going to come out, of course, in the Pentagon Papers. Again, there's a place in Southern California called Santa Monica. In Santa Monica, there's a big research center called Rand Corporation. And one bright sunny day, a man leaves Santa Monica, the Rand Corporation, with a large suitcase full of documents. His name is Daniel Ellsberg. He lives here in Northern California, is alive today, and he's going to get these published to show the nation the long story of our involvement in Vietnam. He ran above, of course, that dreadful Nixon and that dreadful Mitchell, who was his attorney general, who went to jail. Nixon had to resign. But initially, the New York Times, Sulzberger, its editor, at the Washington Post, a very wonderful woman, played in the movies by Meryl Streep. Both of them were threatened by lawsuits and jail time if they published these papers. And finally, they had the gumption, the nerve, to do so. And so suddenly on the headlines, here it all was. The story of 50 years of spending a bloody fortune and still losing. Johnson was president. This war is going to drive him out of the White House. He always referred to this war as that pissant war. This war is going to lose the Democrats the White House. Humphrey's going to run, but he has a hard time running on the Vietnam War platform. And so guess who is going to become president of the United States? Richard Morehouse Nixon. We're just going to go from one tragedy to the other. When Nixon gets angry, the war isn't going his way, he decides to expand it. He moves the war into Laos, into Cambodia. It's unbelievable. It's now becoming the Indochina War. And still there's no. We have this foolish, foolish man who calls himself king in Cambodia, Sihanouk. What a joke he is. They quickly get rid of him, and then we're going to go into an awful, awful period where the communists in Cambodia are going to take over the state, and then they're going to bring everybody who isn't a communist together, and we call that film and that book The Killing Fields. Surely you must remember the story of the slaughter of all the people in Cambodia yet, who were not yet communists. It was unbelievable. We did everything we could to wreck the country, and we succeeded. Ellsberg, of course, was threatened. I think he didn't know exactly what they had in mind. Certainly a long jail term. Sulzberger never batted an eyelash. He was the New York Times, and he would stand by his word that he was going to publish, and he did. And so we got the whole bloody story. And Vietnam got the worst. You know, we finally did leave. Maybe you weren't alive then, or maybe you didn't want to be. We were all racing towards the US Embassy. You saw it on television. People were knocking down the gates of the embassy. They were climbing up the walls. They were all trying to get on the roof of the embassy, because on the embassy roof, there were helicopters taking everybody we could by helicopter offshore to aircraft carriers, which were waiting to rescue us and all the people who had worked for us. Thousands of Vietnamese who had trusted us were now being sacrificed. After a while, the carrier deck was so crowded that they just simply pushed the helicopters off into the ocean. Millions and millions of dollars overboard. And still we couldn't get everybody. You know, in the famous piece that we set, Mr. Kissinger, one of the bad guys of this story, went to Paris and negotiated. And it was to be a slow takeover, but it was fast. They rapidly ran down the coast of Vietnam. It is a coastal civilization. If you were to draw a line from Maine to Miami, that's the length of the Vietnamese coast. It's a very long coast. And most of the people live on the coast or on the two great rivers that penetrate the inland. The Red River, River Rouge in the north, and the Mekong in the south are the ways to speedily get to the interior. Well, there were nothing but troubles. Nobody who signed lived into their agreements at all. There was a woman, very bright woman. She lived in Sacramento, of all places. And she once went to Hong Kong. And while she was there, thousands of Vietnamese were escaping out of Vietnam by these dingy little boats, many of them drowning. But thousands upon thousands got as far as Hong Kong and asked for asylum, and they got it. And so when Joan Didion, the great woman writer, saw this, she said in very prophetic words, I was watching a liquid Auschwitz. And if you're Jewish, you know what that means. A liquid Auschwitz, right there at Hong Kong. People who had been dying to get out, and most who did die, and those who made it with nothing on but their clothes, nothing to carry, nothing to survive with, living as paupers at sea. Joan Didion got it right. The people who didn't get it right, of course, are in the Pentagon. Let me tell you a story. I have an aunt, now dead. She worked for a crooked lawyer. Surprise, surprise, crooked. He wasn't really all that crooked. He just knew that he was doing things you're not supposed to do. So he'd always say to her, leave a lot of nickels on my table. And when he wanted to go out for coffee, he'd go out somewhere and go along and find a phone booth and then make the phone call. His name was Thomas Corcoran, very famous Washington figure. He had written the Security Exchange Act for Franklin Roosevelt. He'd been sent down from Harvard by Frankfurter himself. So when Johnson was president, he had used this lawyer for his campaign. And so he invited her and him. The her was another dragon lady. There are a dime a dozen. This dragon lady was very beautiful again. She'd been married to General Chenault of the Flying Tigers. And Corcoran had been married, but she had committed suicide. So he was now dating Madame Chenault. And they often went to the White House for dinner because Johnson liked them. Turns out, Madame Chenault is a fierce anti-communist. She wants the people to hang tough. So she ends up calling the Vietnamese ambassador to Washington and tells him to tell President Tu, who is the new, they get a new one every other month, new president of South Vietnam, to hang tough, that Nixon will be president soon, and he will be hard on the negotiations in Paris. Well, LBJ himself was as crooked as any Texan ever was crooked, and he had discovered that there were leaks. So he called, who would you call? J. Edgar Hoover, and had J. Edgar check. And Hoover came back and said, this is what happened, and this is who did it. So suddenly, Thomas Corcoran and Madame Chenault were no longer invited to the White House. But the damage was already done. The word had gotten out that Nixon would win, and Nixon would be hard. You know that we ran a campaign called Rolling Thunder, and we dropped more bombs on Vietnam than we dropped on Japan in World War II. And it still didn't work. We had this very braggadocio guy, General Curtis LeMay, Air Force type. He suggested that we just bomb them back to the Stone Age. That's not a solution to a problem. So in the end, we went to Paris. We spent days, and then weeks, and then months arguing about the size of the table, whether it should be round, whether it should be square. It was unbelievable. All this eating up time and eating up lots of American lives. Finally, they got the size right. Finally, that's it. They sat down. Le Duc Tho was going to win a Nobel Prize for Peace. Huh. And Henry Kissinger, who's also going to win a Nobel Prize for Peace, make the agreement that nobody lives up to. We agree that there'll be time to let the sides, and there was no time. We left, they swept in, and everything was gone. The Vietnam War. It was what David Halberstam had said years ago as a journalist. These people were the best and the brightest. Well, if this was the best and the brightest, we were in serious trouble. So Vietnam today is what it is. They even have a movie industry. You might be interested to know they make movies in Vietnam. Things about the green papaya, and they're not very good. And there is one great film that I mentioned already, Indochina. We made some of the most awful films ever made. One, who else could we get but John Wayne, to send us out to battle feeling good? So he made a film about the Green Berets. Now, what in the hell were the Green Berets? Well, what they were Kennedy knew he was in trouble, President Kennedy. So he went down to a place in North Carolina, Fort Bragg. And there he ordered his generals to form a special elite unit called Green Berets. And they were to learn how to jungle fight, how to work in a way that was like the Viet Cong. And the problem was we never got enough of them, but we did get some of them. We got a movie from John Wayne called The Green Berets. Oh, me, the things we did. Everything that he tried, John Fitzgerald Kennedy found himself failing at. And then his worst decision was, we're not winning this war. We have to find out how we can. We're going to send a general, very famous World War II general, Maxwell Taylor, over and make him ambassador. There's a wonderful part of Saigon that I loved when I lived there. It's the old French section of Jardin. There's a wonderful, it's a club. The French call it the Cercle Sportif. And you could see Max Taylor every day. He was just like the Kennedys. The Kennedys who used to play touch football on the White House lawn. Now here was Max Taylor in Saigon playing tennis every day while the war went south. Finally, even Max Taylor said, it's not working. The people do not respect or like or want to be led by No Diem Zim. The bonds issue is terrible. They're still demonstrating against this Catholic minority. So Kennedy sends a famous letter. There's a story in the in English literature about will nobody rid me of this meddling priest. It's called Murder in the Cathedral. Maybe you know it. But someone wanted this meddling man out of the way. So Kennedy authorizes a coup d'etat. We will stage a coup d'etat and replace No Diem Zim. Well, all the things you can say about No Diem Zim, he was a nationalist. He was a true Vietnamese nationalist. He just was not for this side that was going to win. So the green light was passed to our man in Saigon. And the plan went awry. It's hard to run a coup d'etat when you plan to murder somebody. So the two brothers, No Diem Zim in the presidential palace in Jardin, got word early of this coup. He spoke to the American ambassador. All the American ambassador could say was, well, I'll give you free passage out of the country. And No Diem Zim said, no, I will stay and face my fate. So he and his brother fled from the Jardin area, which is the French sector, to the Chinese section of the city in Cholan. They took refuge, took asylum in the cathedral in Cholan, the Catholic cathedral. And then an armored personnel carrier furnished by us arrived at the cathedral. There were negotiations between No Diem Zim and No Diem Nhu and the Viet Cong generals, not Viet Cong, Vietnamese generals who had staged the coup. And they were promised safe passage. No Diem Zim and No Diem Nhu went inside the armored personnel carrier, the black clothes, and they drove off to the big air base, Tan Son Nhut. When the back of the APC came down, there were two blood-stained bodies, No Diem Zim's and No Diem Nhu. They'd been stabbed at least 30 times and had been shot at least 4 times to make sure they were dead. And they were dead. So Kennedy had murdered the head of state of South Vietnam. He had sent the signal. He didn't want it to turn out that way. In fact, those who were in the White House at the day the message came through that both leaders were dead, Kennedy went white and fled out of the room, the briefing room. Of course, he would be dead himself in a couple of years, and the war would go on. As Johnson called it, that pissant war. He always said over and over again to all his advisors, I will not be the first American president to lose a war. Well, guess what? You did lose a war, Mr. Johnson, at tremendous cost. You could see the cost if you arrived at Bolling Air Force Base when the back of the big C-5A aircraft opened up. There was body bag after body bag after body bag. The bags were full of American dead. You just throw them in a body bag and you throw it in the back of a big jet airplane. This was the only war where everybody went to war in a jet aircraft. I flew over on a, if you remember, there was something called Pan Am. Pan Am was flying flights, making tons of money. Flying, every GI who went to war flew by jet from one of the big bases on the California coast, and they landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. And then you went off to your various assignments. So you came by air. If you were lucky, you went home by air, not in a bag, but alive. And all the same problems that we had had in this country were repeated over and over. Racism broke out between Bloods, they were called, black soldiers and white soldiers. The tendency to, how to put it, there were places where you could go to find women. One was a very famous street in Saigon, Tudo Street. And you could find some women who would even go out into the field with you. That is, if you wanted company that bad, you could go to a night defense position. Everything that was wrong in our own society repeated itself. And what was worst of all was it was a drug-infested army. It was much easier to get marijuana, to get cocaine, to get heroin on the streets of Vietnam than it was on the streets of Los Angeles. It got so bad that we couldn't return anybody any longer to the United States because the mother and father would reach out to welcome their son or their daughter. Many women went and realized they were holding a drug addict. So we found a general officer, I'll never forget it, General Guard. He ended his career down at Fort Ord. He was appointed the urinalysis. Everybody who left Vietnam, everybody who left, captains, majors, colonels, generals, privates, sergeants, whoever, had to pass the urinalysis test. And it was only checking on the amount of drugs in your system. And when you passed finally, then you could go. Otherwise, you had to stay. And that's the last thing you wanted, was to stay in Vietnam, for God's sake. So they tried to stop using a month before, so that in the system, it would not show in the urinalysis that was tested on you. I mean, this war was so awful, it's beyond describing. And what is shown, of course, is all those aspects are in the Pentagon Papers. Because everybody knew about urinalysis. Everyone knew General Guard. We had a guy Well, we had two guys. They had very, very important titles. United States Military Advisor, Vietnam. Comas MacVie, they called him Comas MacVie, Commander of the United States Armed Forces, Vietnam. One was the dumbest man I ever met. 4-star general from South Carolina, no less. Boy, they wouldn't even want him in South Carolina with the Boy Scouts. But I remember talking to a very famous man that Kennedy hired to be his court historian, Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And Arthur Schlesinger said to me at one of our big parties at Berkeley that he was very impressed to meet this general because he looked so wonderful in that big, beautiful blue uniform standing in the rose garden of the White House. And I thought, God, he really thinks that that means the guy's a good leader just because he looks good in a uniform in front of a white rose bush. But even professional PhDs can get it wrong. We got rid of him once a certain thing happened that people couldn't believe. There is a holiday, a really big holiday all over Asia. It's called Tet, the New Year. Everybody goes home. You're in China and you're waiting at a train station on Tet, you'll be trampled to death by Chinese who are trying to go home for the holiday. It's the biggest holiday in all of Asia, the Tet. So what happens? In 1968, there's a Tet, as had been in 67 and 65. But this one, it was different, because on this Tet, as the sun came down, 50,000 Viet Cong troops left the area on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other base camps way up country and stormed down to the cities of South Vietnam, Nha Trang, Saigon itself. They overran Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, where the Comas MacVie was living. And he looks out his window and there are thousands of Vietnamese, Viet Cong Vietnamese, and NVA, North Vietnamese Army, that have somehow infiltrated south, coming down that very long trail called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and now positioned, and ahead of them are cache sites, so that when they're given the word, they run as fast as they can. They don't want to be caught. And ahead of them is a food supply, ahead of them is a water supply, ahead of them is ammunition, so that they can hit the coast and have the country collapse. Tet, 1968, and it almost happened. There is a royal capital. If some of you have been to Beijing and seen the Forbidden City, there's a Forbidden City in Vietnam. It's an exact copy of the one in China, in Beijing, because the Vietnamese were doing things in a very Chinese way once they had broken with China. And this had been overrun. We had to have the Marines come in and dig these people out of these ruins body by body. We just had to, and we blew up we blew up Forbidden City. There is no more Forbidden City left in Hue, which was the royal capital of Vietnam in its heyday. It's gone. The Marines saw to that. All the people there died. And then the thing was that there was one flaw in this plan. This plan was General Giap's great plan. Giap, who had won Dien Bien Phu against the French, was now trying to win against us with this total offensive, the Tet Offensive. Problem was that the plan was there was to be a general uprising. In other words, Vietnamese people, poor, very desperate, longing for peace, would now rise up and throw us out. And that didn't happen. They didn't rise up. They scurried wherever they could and hid. They didn't want to be caught in between. And so there was no uprising. So when the Viet Cong got down to the coastline, taking over the city, the sun came up, you know? It's a real problem that way. It's a Hemingway's story. The sun also rises. It does rise every day. The sun comes up and it goes down. And now it's coming up. And all these Viet Cong and NVA, North Vietnamese Army, were now in the open. And they could be seen. And they were wiped out. So everybody lost. But when the newspapers in this country reported on this uprising, when they had been told over and over again that there was light at the end of the tunnel, what kind of light is this? It's a Viet Cong light. We can't have this. And people went wacky. The People's Republic of Berkeley, the home of my university, demonstrations, they just stopped going to school. They just went out every day and demonstrated. We had Reagan then as governor. He gassed the campus. He used tear gas on the students. There was a meeting in the White House. They'd already asked the then Komusakvi, the good guy, who didn't know what to do, and he said he'd need another 1 million men. Another 1 million? There was no way that this happened. So Johnson, as much as he didn't want to, called together a group called the Wise Men. And they came together as a group and advised him. And these were people that went way back, Secretary of State Dean Acheson. These were hardliners, anti-communists, but they said, we've lost. We have simply lost. And it's tearing the nation to pieces. You cannot continue this war and expect you're going to have the war also on the streets of America. You must sue for peace and take whatever price you can get. And so the war came to an end. Not the way we wanted, but at least it came to a bloody end. And Richard Nixon got elected president of the United States. Johnson lost. He even told us he wouldn't run again. He was trying to help Humphrey, but Humphrey couldn't be helped, Senator Humphrey, the vice president, because he'd be stuck with the legacy of Vietnam. The only person who was ever going to work out would be the opposition, and the opposition was in the hands. You know, he looks good today, Nixon does, after the last one we had. But he was very flawed, very venal guy. But nevertheless, he became president. Do you know that he won so big that when they counted up all the votes, he carried every state in the Union except Massachusetts. Every state in the Union. Oh, me. Well, it's over. Joan Didion saw her liquid Auschwitz. Today, I've led trips back to Vietnam for Cal Berkeley alumni. Most of the people alive today in Vietnam weren't alive in the war. They don't know anything about the war. They actually like us. You can go to Hanoi and see the Hanoi Hilton. That's where Senator McCain was prisoner. It's amazing. You can also go to the Cu Chi tunnels, where 2,000 Vietnamese lived underground all during the war. They had their underground water system. They had their underground dining facilities. They'd even run pipelines to kick the smoke so that if you thought, aha, I see smoke coming up from this part of the rubber. They were living on the plantation called the Michelin. I see smoke, there must be. You'd just never find it. It had been diverted several miles away. They're very clever people. You must not ever think your enemy is dumb. They might be a lot smarter than you. So, but today, they gladly show you the Cu Chi tunnels. You take a tour. It's just like Disneyland. You go there and you're underneath the rubber of this great plantation and you're seeing all these places where they slept, sleeping underground to avoid being found by us. We did everything we could. We flew a helicopter every day and every night. It was called a people sniffer. It had a machine on it and it could smell human sweat. We thought, aha, we have a hot spot here. But we didn't want to go to it. So we just blow up the hot spot. We had another system, good old McNamara, always sending us new junk. It was as long as I am, I'm 6 foot, and it was shaped like, it's hard to describe, it's like a missile. And you could put it along a pathway, you drop it from a helicopter. And then you could turn it on so that it would report any movement in the area. So if you heard somebody coming down the path, you go, aha, the enemy is moving, it's nighttime, it's his time. Let's blow up the pathway. And we'd blow the hell out of the, guess what we blew up? An old mother elephant walking down the road. Because the Viet Cong saw us drop those things and they found them. They decided not to move them, but let us be. So all night long, this is how you fight a war with the Viet Cong. You had H&I fire, harassment and interdiction, and you were safe on your 6,000-man base camp, and you fired these things to likely targets outside, here and so out of nowhere, a 105 howitzer would blast away at a path that's maybe 15 miles away. So you never knew when you were going to be fired at if you were Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong were very careful. They like to fish. And in all these many rice paddies, they had fish. But they'd attract the fish with a flashlight. Aha. And so you would fire at the flash. It was over and over again. It was a never-ending situation. Flashlights to fish. They even have an awful, awful dish that they love. They'll cook you up some rice, and they let the fish that they get rot slowly up on a hanging thing. And the juice, rotten juice that falls out, they call nuc mam. And then they put the nuc mam on the fish. I want to tell you, it's like the fish died a terrible death. Never, ever order nuc mam, although they have wonderful horn and crab soup. There was a British writer who knew what was happening and saw the danger for the Americans, but we didn't listen. And so we lost the war, and I've gone way over my time. So thank you, and come again. We're going to do Hemingway soon. The reason we'll do Hemingway is, of course, we're showing a movie. Otherwise, have a nice day.